President Cyril Ramaphosa and his cabinet meeting with business leaders for the first time under the GNU this week. Government is holding its own media briefing in response to that particular meeting. Let's listen.
We also have Mr. James McKay, CEO of the Energy Council of South Africa, and he will give us an update on the National Energy Crisis Committee and the work that's been done in that area. And of course, then we have Mr. Martin Kingston, the chair of the Business for South Africa Steering Committee, who will just wrap up the discussion and also assist us in facilitating a Q&A session. We'll just go ahead and kick off, and I'll invite Minister Dau to give the opening remarks. And after that, Cyril Dix will continue with the program. Thank you.
All right. It seems that briefing, of course, is being held virtually, and we're expecting the first speaker to come through. Government giving feedback on that particular meeting. Just a day after Statistics South Africa released the latest jobs numbers, which showed that about 8.4 million South Africans are currently without a job. There's always been real fears that this is a ticking time bomb in a context where the bulk of those people happen to be young people who've been without work for well over a year. It seems that there's somebody now who is taken back to the virtual podium, if you like, Pak Stau, who of course is the Minister of Trade and Industry. Let's listen.
Yes. Sorry, and I realized that the system was also not allowing me to unmute because it probably did not recognize the participant. But thank you very much for your indulgence to colleagues both in government and business, but also to our colleagues in the media. As has been indicated, we had a discussion yesterday, which is a partnership between the private sector and business under the auspices of Operation Vulindlela, reflecting on essentially where we come from as a country over the past few years and where we're going in terms of our ambition. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in 2023, the country was facing significant challenges. These challenges, of course, at the back of the devastating impact of the COVID pandemic, but also a number of critical challenges that were impeding economic growth and development in our country. And these included the levels of load shedding and energy challenges that we were confronting at the time, the challenges with regards to transport and logistics, but also the impact of crime, including economic crimes, the strategic infrastructure, the impact of corruption. And it was a time at which we needed to reflect as a nation on where we're coming from, what our challenges are, and what we need to do. And we set ourselves some very targeted ambitions towards 2030, first in relation to economic growth, targeting growth at between 3% and 5% at the back of a reliable power supply, or the things that needed to be resolved, and ensure that there's reliable power supply, a growing logistics sector, and a reduction in crime. We also set ourselves ambitious targets with regards to job creation and employment on the basis of increased economic activity, but also overall confidence, societal confidence, and investor confidence that would spur further investment and attract investors into the country and create us as a more attractive investment destination. Next slide, please. To set ourselves these objectives, we had to gather under the same roof between business and government. And we agreed on an initiative, as has been indicated, and we all now know, to address these critical challenges, led by the President of the Republic, and creating the appropriate structures and mechanisms to ensure that the partnership finds expression in practical terms, in terms of actual investments, actual capacity, actual cooperation and collaboration that would ensure that we're able to address the challenges that we confront. In this regard, a joint strategic oversight committee was established, and this would do the day-to-day assessment of progress of the various work streams, if you like, that were established. And amongst these would be the energy work stream with a specific focus on ending load shedding and driving the reform of the energy sector. And part of the work included the establishment of a National Energy Crisis Committee, and a collective endeavor to ensure that we're able to address the issues with regards to energy. And we're currently experiencing the successes of that initiative. Of course, we're still at a point where we monitor it very closely. We're not at a stage where, as a country, we can say we are comfortable that everything is completely sorted, but we're quite happy with the progress that's been made. With regards to transport and logistics, the task was to ensure that similarly a crisis committee is established on national logistics and that it is able to drive the key projects and initiatives with regards to transport and logistics. And lastly, a task team or a program was established around crime and corruption, and this included the establishment of the Joint Initiative on Crime and Corruption, and bringing the necessary public and private sector partners on board. In this regard, on crime, it was Business Against South Africa, and other agencies that were brought together at different levels to enable targeted program implementation. Yesterday was really the first meeting since the elections and the establishment of the Government of National Unity. It enabled us, it enabled us to reflect on where we've come from, but also what the way forward is between both government and the private sector. And a collective expression of confidence of the work that's been done was expressed yesterday, but also a commitment to working together going forward and identifying further areas of collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for those opening remarks. We appreciate your time. I'd like to invite Advocate Anton du Plessis just give us a brief update on the joint initiative on crime and corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for letting me go first. Colleagues on the platform, I'm sorry, I have another very urgent meeting at 9:30 that I need to leave for. So thanks for the indulgence, Chair, letting me go first. The crime and corruption, or it's JICC, it's known as Joint Initiative on Crime and Corruption, was actually added as the third work stream, as the Minister has pointed out. So thank you for letting me go first. But in some ways, it's also a very unique work stream because it's very different to the others, of course. In some ways, quite a lot more complex and also a little bit more contentious to manage because, of course, we need to put in place firewalls throughout the process to protect the independence of the institutions. But I do have colleagues from the DPCI and others online that can help answer some of these questions. So I'm just going to give a very high-level overview of this initiative. And I think what an important point to start with is that this is a very focused and time-bound initiative to enhance government capacity to investigate and prosecute priority complex crimes that cause the most damage to our country. It's very important to make it clear. This is not a budget replacement project or an attempt to outsource any core government work to the private sector, but rather it's a multi-stakeholder approach in line with the ethos of this broader initiative that the Minister's just spoken about, to tap into the very specialized skills that law enforcement and the criminal justice system need to keep pace with the complex and growing threat of crime that we're seeing today. And it's also in line with international best practice around multi-stakeholder collaboration on crime fighting, as well as some of our international obligations to engage with various entities, including the private sector. So it really is a bespoke project, and as that's time-bound. And initially, it will focus on two priorities. There are, of course, many priorities within the criminal justice space, but the two priorities that we'll focus on for the next couple of months is obviously the issue that everyone's aware of is getting off the FATF grey list, and we have very little time. I think we have until January to get through the final two main substantive barriers for that. And then, of course, also ramping up progress in the context of very complex and specific state capture prosecutions. So the two main partners at this stage are the police and the DPCI and the NPA. My colleagues from the DPCI are on the call and can answer questions. But there are also various other initiatives that have been ongoing for some time, and the government has been working with the private sector on these through Business Against Crime South Africa for a number of years. And these initiatives are sort of second-tier priorities at the moment, but are continuing. So the first one, getting off the FATF grey list, as we all know, we've made a lot of progress on that, but there are a number of key challenges left, and the most important one is demonstrating sustained and impact or sustained progress in the investigation and prosecution of complex and standalone money laundering and terrorist financing cases. So the DPCI is working under this initiative, have identified 20 priority cases in this regard, and are working with the private sector to bring in specialist forensic and financial experts to support on these particular identified cases. And of course, this is key to that final qualitative assessment of getting off the grey list. And as I said, it's a very focused project of support, particularly in the context of financial forensics. As far as the NPA is concerned, the NPA is working under this initiative to basically enhance the capacity of its new investigative directorate, which, as you know, was recently made permanent and given criminal investigative powers. But a key missing ingredient, and not only for the NPA, but globally for prosecution services, is the ability to engage with the complex issue of digital evidence, which is found on multiple encrypted devices and which needs to be extracted, analyzed, and then obviously presented as admissible evidence in court. So under this initiative, there will be a standalone digital evidence unit, which will be set up. This will be staffed by international and local experts. Very important to note, it will be governed by a board, which is being appointed with some of the most respected jurists in the country, as well as managed under a special purpose vehicle. And that board will create the firewall between the NPA and this initiative to make sure that there's no undue influence or perceptions of undue influence over the NPA. And this board will then manage the digital unit separately. As I said, it's a standalone unit that will provide services and support initially to the NPA's investigative directorate, because we'll have to start slowly. But over time, the idea is to expand the initiative to provide support on digital evidence to the rest of the criminal justice system. And again, very important, this is not about financial forensics. It's specifically about being able to extract information off encrypted devices and bring that information to court so that it can be admissible as evidence. So those are the two initial projects. Of course, it does address the broader question of capacity constraints. And I do want to end by making the point, Chair, that this is really not about lack of capacity, generally speaking, within the criminal justice system. It's about very specialized skills that all over the world reside in the private sector, and it's bringing them into the NPA and the DPCI on our terms in a way that aligns with international best practice. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Advocate. I'd like to now invite Mr. Redix to give us an update on the National Logistics Crisis Committee. Thank you.
Thanks, Mpumi. Just to say, I think just the context, of course, two of the biggest constraints for economic growth and employment, of course, colleagues know that energy has been an important factor and critical as that in constraining economic growth. That, of course, will be covered in the next bit of after the transport and logistics. The second, of course, which is also having a significant impact, is the ability for us to have a more efficient and competitive logistics system, and particularly around freight rail and ports. You'll see in this graph specifically what we have seen is the plateauing or stabilization of the decline in volumes on the freight logistics, on the freight rail network. Last year, we were able to do 149 million tons. Of course, that is from a relatively low level of what we peaked at in 2017, when it was about 240 million tons. What we do see at the end of the last financial year was an ability just to slightly uptick the amount of volumes on the freight rail network to 152 million tons. Now, this is way beyond the target that has been set in terms of the operational recovery plan. And we think this is going to be quite critical for us, again, through a collaborative effort to try and build intervention and support where we can for Transnet to support us. And of course, the establishment of the National Logistics Crisis Committee that we have there is not, again, very similar to the NECOM. It's not, again, to to create duplicate management structures or to run Transnet management executive and its board is important, but our approach is a collaborative one where we are going to ensure that quite critically the business colleagues who have offered the support and are able to bring the expertise to bear are going to be quite critical. So of course, much of what has happened over the past few months has been the ability to procure and provide operational expertise by the business colleagues, the deployment and support, particularly on the northern corridor, the coal line of over 500 personal security, as Transnet, for example, finalizes its security contract so that, we are able to ensure the deployment and boots on the ground. Already that has a significant impact. We've seen, for example, since the beginning of this year, 51% decline in incidents, particularly on the North Corridor and that. And then, of course, a lot of support on the maintenance of ports. With that, of course, has been the critical area of the reform program, and that's quite critical. Critical because we're going to have to ensure that there's a high degree of competition. We have to allow for private sector, third-party access on the rail, various forms of private sector participation is going to be quite critical for us to build a more efficient and competitive logistics system. As many of you know, for example, President has assented to the Economic Regulation of Transport Act that gives effect to the establishment of the Economic Transport Regulator. That's going to be quite critical. Already Cabinet has adopted the PSP framework. Again, we're going to have to look at specific details around what PSP potential interventions could happen, either in the ports, on the rail system. And more importantly, the roadmap, the freight logistics roadmap, again, was adopted and has been published, and it sets out quite clearly a more or less a short to medium term goal around the reforms that we would have to do in the logistics sector going forward. What we have, of course, next slide, please. What we have, of course, is the point about the logistics sector is about looking at the operational performance and also look at the reform. But as it is right now, I mean, if we are not able to get that volumes up, and specifically above 200 million tons per annum, then we do sit with a significant challenge where you begin to see the impact on critical sectors that are dependent on both the port and the freight rail system. Mining in particular, for example, bulk commodities, iron ore, manganese, chrome, magnetite, and more importantly, coal. And so it's important for us to work quite closely with the Transnet leadership to be able to ensure that we do have a more ambitious target to push up the volumes of what we are able to get from pit to port. And that's going to be quite critical. So you already see with this particular graph, where you begin to see the negative impact is just when volumes remain below 200 million tons per annum. And so we've got to push and be much more ambitious. Of course, the engagement with the Transnet leadership is a multi-pronged engagement on a whole set of different areas, from refurbishment to maintenance to financing to address backlog, issues around procurement of equipment, getting in the relevant expertise. So this is going to be quite critical. So we try and avoid the knock-on effect of declining business confidence, for example, ensuring that we set more ambitious targets for both freight and ports. And that, of course, is important for us to see significant more economic growth and ensure that we develop greater partnerships and indication around how we get that moving. So these are going to be critical areas for us to be able to ensure that collaboration, as we did for ESCOM, as we did for NECOM in the implementation of the Energy Action Plan, that we do get a lot more traction, much more vigorous and committed implementation, and we're going to have to be much more ambitious and faster in ensuring that we continue to see improvements beyond the kind of improvements that are there. We've got to be very ambitious. This table just basically sets what are the key priorities for us to be able to ensure that we do improve our logistics interventions, and really to look at potentially just governance issues, and then the second area looks at operational performance, and then the reform program. Critically, of course, I think the the announcement is going to be done fairly soon, just on the allocation and the reporting lines in terms of the shareholder. We already know, of course, the Department of Transport is responsible for policy, and that will require for us to be able to, on the basis of the changes in the setup of government and the government of national unity, with the DPE no longer there, that how do we deal with the Transnet as an entity, and this is going to be quite critical. We're going to have to ensure that we provide additional capacity both at a board and exco level, and experts and skills to support that. Of course, with the shareholder agreement, the shareholder allocations sorted out, it requires for us to be able to potentially ensure that we do get much more tighter compacts that is going to be there. The deployment of safety and security on the rail lines are going to be critical to stem the tide of continued cable theft and metal theft. The reform program is very important because this is an indication of getting confidence back into the rail system, but also ensuring for the first time that we get private sector, particularly third-party access. So the network statement that was issued earlier this year has to be finalized. And again, we've said that for this month, potentially would run into September, but it's linked to the last point over there, that once we've done the network statement, we can then proceed to open access around third-party access to that. Again, the economic regulator is going to be quite critical for setting up and ensuring that we do all the necessary appointments, including the board, and the finalization of that process. And then, of course, whether there are elements of private sector participation outside of third-party access, or the PSP framework to be able to identify that. And you'll see here, particularly, we're quite clear on the responsibility and the timelines. We're going to hold to this timeline. And as we provide you updates, we'll give you updates as to, how we've done this. But this is a key focus for us, very similar to the way that we've done on energy, where we're going to hone in and focus on ensuring that we improve our logistics efficiency and introduce the reforms around competition in the rail and the port space. Thanks, Mpumi.
Thank you very much, Rudy. Much appreciated. Just we can move on directly to James McKay. Mr. McKay, CEO of Energy Council, just to give us an update on the National Energy Crisis Committee work that's been done to date. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, all. Fantastic to be here. Maybe just I'd like to also reiterate the very positive sentiment from the meeting, in that the greater collaboration really is creating renewed confidence in the economy, and I think that's very important. Importantly, I think the conversation really started with the Energy Action Plan, which in a very simple way, when we tracked back, was built on 3 pillars of fix, build, and reform. Recognizing, I think there's a lot to celebrate in the fix, especially when we look at load shedding, but also now moving out of load shedding, a very clear and good discussion that our focus now needs to move from load shedding towards addressing increasing system cost, system efficiency, as well as making sure sustainable investment and structural reform. So just kind of referencing, I think, to the fix portion, there's clearly a lot we can celebrate. It's always an easy conversation to talk about the successes, but the clear caveat that we have to keep pressure on continuing the performance recovery work on the power stations, but recognizing, I think, the good work that's been done, certainly by Eskom, a number of other role players also in government, but also sort of the way that business has really leaned in and contributed. I think, again, growing confidence that we will be able to call an official end to load shedding in the near future. But really, this is based on the sort of continued and increasing focus on performance data and planning that's giving the confidence, rather than just the number of days. But it was highlighted that we are approaching 150 days load shedding free, which will be a major milestone. And the business effort through NECOM at the power station performance at this stage is continuing. Next slide. Thank you very much. So then that takes us really to the other 2 pillars, which is this focus on build and reform. So we must be deliberate on our focus now to accelerate our energy transition. We can keep the lights on, but we now need to really deal with this very complex and challenging environment. Again, confirming that NECOM, under the Energy Action Plan, is the vehicle that we're going to use to drive collaboration and delivery, but that will be a fit-for-purpose NECOM, so it's an adjusted in terms of focus areas. I think importantly, the discussion also highlighted that we are facing increasing system costs. This is going to have a significant impact on both community and industry. So very important that we deal with this and ensure focus. Recognizing this is partly due to the recovery of load shedding, which was very necessary, but kind of going forward now, we have to look to ensure very transparent system planning and ensure an adjusted critical path. Under the sixth administration, I think at the NECOM level, we created the critical path to guide us around taking action around ending load shedding. We need to now look at that, an adjusted critical path to look at the new focus areas, which is more around the reform and the system. So we do need to drive forward for a sort of a more efficient system with least cost impact for all consumers. That will take time. These costs are in the system, and so we do have to recognize that and deal with it. But immediately it highlights the importance of things like grid expansion, market reform, addressing the role of sustainable municipalities, all of which will unlock huge investment in new generation as well as modernization and capacitation. And I think that there was very good debate across all the role players in the meeting on these points. Importantly, also highlighted, I think, was linking to the last point in the slide of sustainability, is recognizing the increasing risk and impact of global climate change policy, and specifically CBAM. I think it was referenced directly that by the presidents, this is coming at us. We will have to deal with it. It will impact our global competitiveness. So we must develop a clear plan and response to this, yet it is very challenging. Thank you. Next slide. So then really, I think, moving forward, so it's been termed a little bit of a repurposed NECOM, and you'll see on the left the focus areas as I've referenced. But really, from the president, ministers and business leaders have all expressed support that the partnership has built trust, is delivering success, but now we really need to intensify our work, pay attention to where the gaps and risks are, because it's a much more complex environment going forward, and then be very deliberate in our actions. I think these were specific comments raised across the board by senior leaders. This work will be led under the new Department for Electricity and Energy under the leadership of Minister Ramaphosa, who made some strong statements and also supported the role of private sector. And private sector will continue to now sort of double down and mobilize capacity to support these efforts and bring innovative ideas to the table, which was also encouraged directly by the president. Just on that point, the Energy Council facilitates the governance and an open process for all business to participate within the NECOM structure, but importantly within the agreed NECOM framework and governance structure. So I certainly would encourage anyone who is interested to participate, please register. There are links available on either on our website or have been sort of proposed or floated around in social media. So I think just closing off, NECOM 2.0, we're super excited. I think there's great alignment on what needs to be done. Really now it's about how do we mobilize, how do we kind of drive towards kind of delivery under this new 7th administration. Clear kind of calls for good structure with solid terms of references need to be established, readjusting the critical path, as I mentioned, and then really driving towards a rules-based transition where all parties can understand there's transparency and it creates confidence as to how we take forward now into this next phase of NECOM under the leadership of Minister Ramaphosa. Thanks very much, Mpumi.
Thank you so much, James. I'll now hand over to Martin, who will just do a recap for us and also will take over the Q&A as well. Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mpumi, and thanks to all the other presenters. So I'll be quick because I'm sure that there will be points that people want to raise. Suffice to say, the meeting was a very constructive meeting and effectively a reset and mobilization of phase 2, if you like, of the platform to leverage the experience that we've had over the past 12 months, which really has been informed by a disciplined and aligned approach focusing on really critical priorities and interventions. And as we've heard already, leverage of 3 key areas. One is skills and expertise, where the private sector can support government always at arm's length and where appropriate. Secondly, the need to improve operational efficiency, and thirdly, structural reform. And If we look at this slide and what we've seen over the past 12 months, and we'll be distributing these slides, so I won't go through them in detail. We're all familiar with the very significant and sustained reduction in load shedding, in part attributable to new generation already added and in the pipeline. The structural reform evidenced by the establishment of the NTCSA, the need to put in place the requisite senior capacity within Eskom, such as the appointment of the CEO, and restructuring a balance sheet so it's fit for purpose. Similar approach, obviously, with respect to Transnet, where once again we've got a guarantee from government which has enabled Transnet to reorganize its balance sheet or start to do so, the appointment of new executives across the senior management of the group, the mobilization as appropriate of private sector expertise again to support that work. And some of that is evidenced by less waiting time for vessels at anchor, but equally in terms of structural reform, the approval of the rail PSP framework and the freight logistics roadmap, as we heard from Rudy. And then finally, and Anton touched on much of this in the context of his presentation on crime and corruption, a reduction in security incidents on the coal line, forensic analysis and specialist skills in particular there, which is going to drive much of the work to address the FATF or the remaining FATF issues, putting in place the Joint Initiative on Crime and Corruption. And all of these platforms have been essential platforms, government platforms, to make sure that we can oversee and indeed manage the work and indeed the critical paths going forwards, and then agreement and alignment on key projects where there should be intervention. And then finally, if we can go to the last page, what we agreed, and these slides are obviously from yesterday's engagement with the President and members of Cabinet who were present, some very specific interventions in the immediate short term, all of which we have heard about. So the finalization of the prioritization of NECOM, the consideration of the ERA bill, which we consider to be an absolutely critical enabler to move forward in the context of structural reform with energy. On transport and logistics, the reinforcement of the Transnet board and senior management with additional skills and expertise, the revision of the shareholder compact, as Rudy was talking about, as well as the updated network statement being issued, and obviously an appropriate role for third-party operators, the private sector, in the context of open access on the rail network. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, in the context of crime and corruption, FATF, where we absolutely need to ensure that we've got the resources in place to be able to prosecute high priority cases, and the promulgation of the MPA Amendment Act. All of this requires very significant mobilization of resources, expertise and skills on both sides of the table, both for government as well as within the B4SA structures and the private sector more broadly. And we've said very clearly, and again it came up yesterday, that although there are other areas that the partnership is under pressure to look at, we will do so without in any way compromising the critical focus on these three areas. And only when we have satisfied ourselves that we've got the capacity on both sides will we extend the reach of the partnership. And with that, if I can start to take some questions, please. I see that there are, I think, 2 hands up, so we'll take both of them, if we may, or maybe 3. So firstly, Carol, and then Tando, and then finally Ray. So Carol, over to you.
Good morning, Martin. Good morning, everyone. A couple of questions. I mean, one of the issues is, well, especially with regards to energy, is going to be the cost of all this. And James kind of mentioned it and saying, you know, there's a lot of costs in the system. And we have to acknowledge those. And Eskom's and the pricing model, we also know, is a...
All right, so there you have it, a virtual sitting there where government is giving feedback, if you like, after meeting with members of the business sector, so I should say perhaps captains of industry, for the first time under the government of national unity. And it seems, from at least from my vantage point, that there were a number of meetings, and this is the culmination of those gatherings. We heard from Pakstyle, who's the Trade and Industry Minister, speaking about Operation Vulindlela really being at the center of this reform agenda in the state, if you like. They've targeted economic growth growth between 3 and 5% by 2030. That hopefully will come with job creation and increased in business confidence. We also heard there from the Energy Crisis Committee saying the Energy Action Plan is where it all began, at least in their talks. They're feeling buoyed by the fact that we've received now a couple of months without load shedding, saying that we're certainly turning the tide insofar as that crisis is concerned. The Logistics Crisis Committee also gave their own feedback, saying that they're going to ensure at some stage there's a high degree of competition. That means, of course, allowing more private sector players in the logistics sector. We'll continue listening into that virtual feedback session with questions now being posed by some of the country's journalists and get you a sense of what the way forward looks like in a context where, of course, Stats SA has announced that the unemployment rate in this country has ticked up now at 33.5%, which essentially means 1 in 3 people is currently without a job. There's going to be a desperate need for solutions to get that right.